Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell. Now, this week I'm going to be returning to the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. And in this episode, I'm going to be deconstructing and sharing my analysis of the interview of Alex Murdaugh, which SLED did on the night that Alex Murdaugh claimed to have found Maggie and Paul shot dead at Moselle. So this interview is very interesting because it's at the crime scene on the night. So it's the first account, if you will. And it also took place in a car, which is a really fascinating dynamic. And I get into some of that within this breakdown. So you have Special Agent David Owen from SLED sat in the driver's seat. Now, he's the one asking all the questions. Alex Murdaugh is sat in the passenger seat. And you can see that makes him feel uncomfortable and he can't get eye contact with people. He can't see what's going on or see how things land. And I talk about that. And then you've got Danny Henderson, who was Alex Murdaugh's personal attorney, sat behind Special Agent David Owen, and then Detective Laura Rutland, who was sat behind Alex Murdaugh. Now, she's from the Colleton County Sheriff's Office. So some very interesting dynamics are going on. I was watching and listening to Alex Murdaugh's account, and I'm going to be breaking it down for you. But before I do that, I just want to thank you all for subscribing to Crime Analyst. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Just hit the link and hit the like, and you can super like me. Thank you for your gifts and your donations. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for commenting. I do try and get to your comments. Please keep sharing with me what you think and cases that you would like me to cover. So I'm not going to talk too much more. I want to get straight into it. There are a number of very puzzling things that happen within this interview, and there are a number of red flags that I want to share with you as well. So let's get started. At the start of the interview, Special Agent David Owen asked Alex Murdaugh to clarify his name and his contact details, and he asked the name of his attorney in the back of the car who was sat directly behind him. Then SLED's David Owen, who leads the interview the majority of the time, explained who he was, and he also said that he hated to do this, but... well, I think you should take a listen to this for yourself.
All right. As I stated, I'm David Owen and Laura Rutland with Colleton County, and I'm with SLED. I hate to have to do this.
I understand. Yeah. I totally understand. Yeah. So you don't have any problem with it.
So just start at the top. Take your time.
Like when I came back here, I mean, I pulled up and I could see them, and I knew something was bad. I ran out. I knew it was really bad. And my boy over there, I could see it was.
Sorry.
And I could see his brain on his... And I ran over to Maggie, and actually, I think I tried to turn Paul over first. I tried to turn him over, and I don't know, I figured it out. His cell phone popped out of his pocket. I started to try to do something with it, thinking maybe, but then I put it back down really quickly. Then I went to my wife, and I could see.
Did you touch Maggie at all?
I did. I touched them both.
Okay.
I tried to do it as limited as possible, but I tried to take their pulse on both of them. And, I called 911 pretty much right away, and she was very good. I talked to her I told her I was going to get off the phone to call some family members. I did that.
What family members did you call?
I called my brother Randy, and I called my brother John. And I tried to call a little boy, real good friend that's right around the corner from here, but I didn't get him.
Okay. What all was around Paul when you walked up?
Blood.
Anything else?
I mean, there were some body things, yes, sir.
I mean, like any other evidence? I know you said the phone fell out the pocket, but did you see anything else that didn't belong or shouldn't belong or that wasn't part of Paul?
No, sir, not the... No, sir.
How about Maggie?
No, sir.
You didn't see anything around them?
Okay, so let's break that down. He first said, I think I tried to turn Paul over first. I tried to turn him over. I don't know. I figured it out. Now, when he said I figured it out, I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, but Paul was lying face down, and I don't know why he would want to turn him over. You can check for a pulse without turning someone over. He later clarified that he didn't succeed in turning Paul over. He next said, and his cell phone popped out of his pocket and I tried to do something with it, thinking maybe, but then I put it back down really quickly. This utterance about the phone is very interesting. Why would he try to do anything with Paul's phone? And what sort of thing was he trying to do exactly? Now, I don't know, I can't answer that question, and he didn't say. And what's more, he wasn't asked when he should have been. Also, surely finding his dead son and dead wife would be his sole focus, checking for pulses and calling for help, not Paul's phone that fell out of his pocket. Now, I suspect he wanted SLED to know in case his fingerprints were on the phone. That's the only reason that I can think that he would volunteer this information, and Paul's phone was then placed on his back. Now, one of the things that struck me is if Paul was indeed holding the phone when he was shot, it most likely would have fallen to the ground. But here it was placed on Paul's back. The comment about trying to do something with his phone, I believe that this is leakage. And I believe he did try and do something with Paul's phone. That much was true. Perhaps he realised that there was not much battery left on Paul's phone. It later died at 10:34 p.m, but it was at 2% for some time. It's somewhat ironic that it was indeed Paul's phone that had incriminating evidence on it, and perhaps Murdaugh's instinct was right, that he needed to try to do something with it. But he didn't, and that evidence was significant at trial. He then said, I touched them both. I tried to do it as limited as possible, but I tried to take the pulse of both of them. Now, Murdaugh said that to the dispatcher too when he made the 911 call. But what's interesting is that there's no actual evidence of him doing that, either whilst he was on the 911 call with the dispatcher, and we don't hear him do it, and we also see no physical evidence that he has done it. And given where Maggie and Paul's bodies were, some 30 feet apart, that would have been a real challenge for him to do this in the 19 to 20 second window that Murdaugh said he did it in. Now, when I'm talking about there's no physical evidence that he did it, I mean that Murdaugh had no blood spatter or brain matter on him that I could see with the naked eye, or on his arms or his hands. And this was a bloody and messy scene, make no mistake about that. In fact, Murdaugh appeared to be wearing a clean, round-necked white t-shirt. Now, given the nature of the victim's injuries and the fact that they were shot by somebody who was close by and that they didn't see it coming, I would expect there to be a lot more blood on his shirt and also on him. But there wasn't, and that should have raised a question right from the start. At other scenes where family members have discovered their loved ones lying in pools of blood, and of course, if you don't know whether someone is alive or not, they have cradled their loved one and cuddled them, and they try to do CPR with their loved one. But they hold their loved one, and therefore they're oftentimes covered in blood. But noticeably, that's not what happened with Alex Murdaugh. And it didn't happen either with Michael Peterson and his wife Kathleen, who he said that he discovered in a pool of blood at the bottom of a staircase. In fact, Michael Peterson actually took the time to take his shoes and socks off before he got close to Kathleen. And then he cleaned himself up before the police arrived, just like Oscar Pistorius did. Pistorius washed his hands before Inspector Botha arrived at the scene of Reeva Steenkamp's brutal murder. Bizarrely, he'd also moved Reeva's body down the stairs. Well, going back to Murdaugh, blood staining and brain matter being absent are significant in my opinion. It's an important absence at this scene, particularly given what he told the dispatcher and the officers who interviewed him at the scene. What he told them, and what he said he did, and his physical presentation just don't match up. They're not congruent, and that should have raised a red flag right from the start. What I also found very interesting was that although Murdaugh made a lot of noise and sounds as if he were crying throughout the car interview, I didn't see any tears. Not one. There was certainly a lot of clearing the nasal passages and hoiking logies and clearing his throat and spitting, but I saw an absence of water, of fluids and tears, and therefore I'm not really sure why he was clearing his throat other than perhaps to make it sound authentic. And perhaps knowing that they couldn't see the front of his face, the noises and covering his face and shrugging his shoulders, moving them up and down, might seem authentic from behind or the side, like he's actually crying, but I don't see any actual tears. Again, sometimes when someone is making a lot of noise, it acts as a distraction, and you can miss the BGO, the blinding glimpse of the obvious, as I call them. What I don't see in this interview is authentic emotion. And granted, everyone responds differently, and trauma has an impact on everybody. But there seems to be an insincere reaction and emotion, particularly with all the noise that he's making and the way that he keeps looking across at the officer to see how his answers are landing with him. Now, granted, you also get a much better sense about someone when you've baselined their behaviour. And like I said, of course, this was a traumatic event. But what I do see is that there were times when Murdaugh is very clearly checking in to see the impact of what he's saying and the officer's reaction to what he's saying. In other words, he's very conscious of impression management, which points to deception. If someone is genuinely in trauma, they're not assessing somebody else for how their behaviour impacts them. They are just in that moment. They are in flow. And that's what's different and what stands out with this particular interview. Also, there's a number of occasions where he goes off on tangents and gives a lot of extraneous information, and I'm going to give you a few examples of those times. Here's one of them. Take a listen to this.
How about Maggie?
No, sir.
You didn't see anything around them? What made you come out here tonight?
I went to... My mom's a late-stage Alzheimer's patient. My dad's in the hospital. My mom gets anxious when she does. I went to check on them and Maggie. Maggie's a dog lover, and she fools with the dogs. And I knew she'd gone to the kennel. I was at the house. I left the house and went to my mom's for just a little while. Tried to call her when I left. Texted her, no response. When I got back to the house was obviously nobody was in there, so I figured they're still up here fooling around. Paul was gonna be getting set up to plant. Our sunflower seeds got sprayed and died, and he was refiguring to plant the sunflower seeds. So I came back up here and I drove up and saw and called.
I have to say that this is such a bizarre monologue at the top of this interview. Now, I believe Murdaugh is struggling because of the power dynamics in the car and the way this interview is set up. But I'm going to share with you the subtext to what he's really saying and conveying with this monologue. Here are the headlines. 1, that he's a dutiful, caring son who looks out for his mother and father. 2, that Maggie was a dog lover and she fools with the dogs. Now, fools is an odd word for me. Maybe it's a southern thing. But the reality was that the dogs were in cages up at the kennels 1/4 mile from the house because they were actual hunting dogs. They were working dogs, or dogs with jobs as I call them, and not petting dogs. But what Murdaugh wants us to know is that whilst he was with his parents who were ill, Maggie was fooling around with the dogs because she was a dog lover and didn't really care about his parents being ill, and he takes his responsibility seriously. 3, Murdaugh said that he texted Maggie and called her, but she didn't respond. That's followed by a long pause. Murdaugh then scratched his head and tried to look over at Special Agent David Owen, who sat next to him in the driver's seat, but he gets nothing back. He continued that he went to the house and realised that they were still fooling around. Then he talked about his son Paul. Paul was going to plant sunflower seeds. The sunflowers had been killed and he was refiguring it out, how he was going to replant the seeds and put that mess right. The subtext here is, my good-for-nothing son. Then Murdaugh said he drove up and that he saw, and then he faded off, and called, and he faded off again. Now, importantly, he doesn't complete either sentence. This is an example of fading facts, and fading facts are an indication of deception. Also, the fact that Maggie never responded to him, that again implies that she's not doing the thing that she should be doing, whilst he's being the dutiful son. Also interestingly, Murdaugh avoided the word murder. He doesn't mention murder at all in that monologue or any thereafter. The word is never mentioned. When asked about the relationships, and he's firstly asked about the relationship between Maggie and Paul, then also about himself and Maggie, and then himself and Paul, there are some very interesting moments. Listen to this.
Had Maggie and Paul been arguing over anything?
No.
What was their relationship like?
Wonderful.
Wonderful. How about yours and Maggie's?
Wonderful. I mean, I'm sure we had little things here and there, but we had a wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship.
And yours and Paul's relationship?
As good as it could be.
These are instructive moments in the interview. When asked of Paul and Maggie's relationship, Murdaugh said they had a good one and weren't arguing or upset with each other. When asked about his relationship with Maggie, he said, "We had a wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship." Now this for me had Scott Peterson vibes when he was asked by Diane Sawyer about his relationship with Lacey, who was pregnant when he murdered her. And he said, glorious. This was an oversell. He's overselling it because it's a lie. And I believe the same is true here. What Murdaugh withheld is that Maggie was not living with him and that they were arguing about money and she wanted out. But no, he didn't say any of that. He said, wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship. A double oversell. When asked about his relationship with Paul, he said, as good as it can be. As good as it could be. What does that mean? You know, it's such an odd thing to say, particularly as Paul has just been brutally murdered and he's allegedly just found his son dead, with his brains blown out. And so to say as good as it could be, perhaps he's missing the words under the circumstances. For me, it felt like those words might be missing, but either way, it could be interpreted that he didn't really like Paul. For me, it's out of place and it's such an odd thing to say when Paul has been murdered and when he has apparently discovered him. Also, Murdaugh did a side-eye to check how that landed with the officer. He wanted to know whether Special Agent Dave Owen was buying what he was selling. Special Agent David Owen then asks him if he's been having problems out there. And listen to Murdaugh's answer.
Have y'all been having any problems out here? Trespassers? People breaking in?
None that I know of. The only thing what comes to my mind is my son Paul was in a boat wreck a couple years ago, and there's been a he was charged with being arrested for being a driver. There's been a lot of negative publicity about that, and there's been a lot of people online just really vile stuff. But when Paul's out and about, people routinely, I don't think I know the full story, because I don't think they give it to me, but he's been punched and hit and just attacked a lot. So, but nothing like this.
Yeah. Any one person in particular or group of people?
I don't know.
That you could think of?
Not that I know, no, sir.
Has he, other than being assaulted, has he received any direct threats related to the boat accident?
Oh, yes. All the time he gets
recently?
Yes, sir. He gets them all the time.
Okay.
He gets them all the time.
What kind of,
I'm gonna kick your ass, I've never been privy firsthand,
Is that through social media or?
No, ma'am. It's mostly like if he goes out places is what he goes out like somewhere. He's in college, so if he goes out is what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I can find out better details from some of his younger friends on that.
So here, Murdaugh jumps straight in with the boat crash motive again and said, and I quote, "Paul has been punched, attacked, hit and threatened in response to the boat accident resulting in the death of Mallory Beach, mostly in person and mostly from people Paul didn't know." He added that Paul got threats all the time, he said, the double for emphasis. Yet he couldn't provide any detail about any incidents or any specific threats. Not one. He said that, yet throughout this interview there's an absence of anger and urgency about whoever has threatened Paul or whoever has potentially murdered Paul and Maggie. In fact, Murdaugh was sat in the car talking calmly. He spoke slowly and deliberately at times, which felt to me like it was rehearsed or scripted. Now again, watch the interview for yourselves, but for me, these are big red flags. I would expect to be hearing things like, "I need to know who did this," or "How did this happen?" or "Why did this happen?" and "These people need to be brought to justice." These sorts of things would be said, and I would expect these things to be accompanied by overwhelming feelings of anger and grief and wanting to know what law enforcement were going to do next and when they would do it by, and a sense of urgency, particularly if this was an execution-style hit on your own family. And the obvious thing for me is that you might be thinking that you're next. But Murdaugh doesn't seem to be concerned about that at all. Not one utterance about it. Funny that. He doesn't make one utterance about it, and for me, that's significant. He then listed a few of Paul's friends and said Paul was going to move into a house in Colombia with his friends. He then named two of Paul's friends, one being Rogan, who lived around the corner, who is a real good, helpful young man, he said. That was interesting to me. You see, hearing him say this, I believed that Rogan Gibson was very important, and I immediately wanted to know more about Rogan Gibson, given how Murdaugh talked about him and described him here, and I wrote a note to follow up regarding Rogan Gibson. Remember I told you that right before Paul was shot, he was messaging with a friend, and he recorded a video of a dog who had a problem with his tail. Well, Rogan Gibson was that friend. In fact, he was Paul's longtime friend, and his dog was staying at the kennels. Paul was worried about the dog's tail. He called Rogan asking if something was wrong with the dog's tail. He called him at 8:40 p.m. and 20 seconds, and the call lasted 4 minutes and 14 seconds. Now, significantly, whilst on that call, Rogan testified in court that he heard Miss Maggie and Mr. Alex voices. That's huge. Take a listen to this. Here's Rogan in his own words testifying in court.
Did you talk to Paul again after that initial conversation?
I did.
All right. And when was that, roughly?
Around 8:40.
Okay. And what was that conversation about?
He called and asked if something was wrong with the dog's tail.
Okay. And was that the first you were hearing about that?
That's correct.
Tell me about your conversation.
I told him that, I wasn't real sure. I just dropped him off there Sunday. And told him let's try to see if he can get me a picture or FaceTime me and let me see what was going on with the dog's tail.
All right. Where was Paul when he called you?
He was at the dog kennels.
And how do you know that?
I could hear the dogs barking in the original call.
Is he describing to you what he's seeing on Cash's tail?
That's correct.
And Cash was at the kennels?
He was.
Did you hear any other voices when you were on the phone with Paul about 8:40?
I did.
And what voices did you hear?
I heard Miss Maggie.
And who else did you hear?
And I thought it was Mr. Alex that I heard.
You thought it was Mr. Elliott. You talked to Paul, and what did y'all talk about? What was he going to do?
He was going to try to FaceTime me. He said, you know how the service is out here. He said, if I can't get the FaceTime to go through, I'll send you a video.
And why was he going to FaceTime you? What's the difference between FaceTime and a regular call?
So I could see what was wrong with the dog.
And y'all talked about how the service is out here?
That's correct.
And what did you mean by that?
Most of the time you got enough service to make a call. I mean, sometimes the calls would break up, but a FaceTime, couldn't really get a whole lot of service to make the FaceTime call. It's kind of lagging.
Y'all had problems with that before?
That's correct.
Did y'all discuss what to do if the FaceTime didn't work?
We did.
And what was the discussion?
He was going to send me a video of it, of the dog.
He was going to video it and then do what with it? Text it to you?
That's correct.
Is that the last time you ever talked to your friend?
That was.
Did y'all try to FaceTime?
We did.
Did it work?
It came through, but it was kind of lagging. I couldn't tell what was going on.
And then never heard from him again?
That's correct.
Did you ever get that video?
I did not.
After you never got the video, did you try to reach back out to Paul to see if you could get him to respond?
I did. I called him a few times and texted him.
Did he ever respond?
He didn't.
Did you reach out to anyone else trying to get Paul to respond?
I texted Miss Maggie.
Did she respond?
She didn't.
Did you hear Rogan's voice go up when he answered the question about whether that was the last time he heard from Paul? That was raw emotion. So Rogan had told Paul to send a picture or to FaceTime with a video so that he could see his dog Cash's tail for himself. At 8:41 p.m. and 38 seconds, Paul received a Snapchat message from Rogan. Paul then initiated a FaceTime with Rogan for more than 11 seconds at 8:44 p.m. and 34 seconds, but it didn't work well, so the plan was that if FaceTime didn't work, that Paul would send him the video. At 8:44 p.m. and 55 seconds, Paul records a video for Rogan at the kennels. He never sent that video, and Paul's phone was locked at 8:49 p.m. and 1 second, and it went dark forever. Now, as Rogan said, he tried calling and messaging Paul, but he couldn't get a reply. He then tried Miss Maggie, but she didn't reply either. Remember I mentioned that Maggie received a text from Rogan in part 3? At 9:34 p.m. and 14 seconds, Maggie's phone received the text, "Tell Paul to call me," which was unread. Now it's reasonable to believe that Murdaugh knew Rogan was speaking with Paul, texting and calling with him, which is why he called Rogan that night and told Rogan what happened. It's certainly odd that Murdaugh named him and said he called him that night and referenced him in this interview with police. That stood out to me straight away when I heard Murdaugh say that he called Rogan and slipped in all these positive sentiments about him. I immediately wondered why Murdaugh would call Rogan Gibson, having just discovered his wife Maggie and his son Paul had been brutally murdered. And he didn't just call him once. The first time he called him was at 10:21 p.m. and 25 seconds, after calling his brothers Randy Murdaugh and John Marvin Murdaugh. There was no answer. At 10:24 p.m. and 43 seconds, Murdaugh texts Rogan Gibson, stating, "Call me." At 10:25 p.m. and 49 seconds, Murdaugh attempts to FaceTime Rogan Gibson. There was no answer. And at 10:30 p.m. and 31 seconds, Murdaugh again attempts to FaceTime Rogan Gibson. There was no answer. Now, Rogan Gibson testified he was already asleep at this time, but Murdaugh called him once, texted him once, and attempted 2 FaceTime calls in 9 minutes. He sure did want to speak to Rogan Gibson that night. Now, I've looked at his phone data from that night, and what's interesting to me is that yes, he's prolific and on his phone a lot, and I have a lot more to say about that, but he only called his son Buster Murdaugh once, and that was at 10:44 p.m. and 20 seconds. The connection lasted 8 seconds, so that's not enough time to explain to him that his mother Maggie and his brother Paul had been shot dead. 3 minutes later, at 10:47 p.m., Murdaugh texted Buster and Tracy White and Brooklyn White, stating, "Call me urgent." So what's also instructive to me when I analyse Murdaugh's phone data is that he called his own remaining son Buster after calling Rogan Gibson 3 times. That stands out to me. I mean, you would think that his remaining son would be a priority at this time. That he'd want to, 1, ensure that Buster was safe. Remember, Murdaugh's narrative was that his family had been gunned down in a revenge attack. 2, that he'd want to hold him and comfort him. And 3, that he'd want to ensure that Buster heard it from him and no one else. But that's not what Murdaugh did. Buster was not his priority. Rogan Gibson was. That's revealing to me. He knew Rogan knew something, but once the police arrived, his time was taken up with them. So Murdaugh was right about Paul's phone. Remember, he said that he picked it up. I believe he panicked. He was under a lot of pressure in a very short time window. And he was right about Rogan Gibson. Both were extremely important in the stories that they would tell about that night, and they cross-corroborated each other's story, which was significant. But that's not the only available evidence from that night. Alex Murdaugh's phone, his steps, and his car data painted a very different picture to what he told the police sat in the police car the night he claimed to have discovered Maggie and Paul's bodies. And next week I'm going to return to all 4, starting with the rest of Murdaugh's interview with SLED, because I'm not done, not just yet. And talking of stories, take a listen to this.
So is there anybody that you can think of that we need to talk to tonight? Is there a name that comes to mind?
I mean, I can't tell you anybody that I'm overly suspicious of off the top of my head.
Okay.
You know? I mean, this is such a stupid thing. I'm even embarrassed to say it. But it just didn't make any sense. I just hired a guy out here, and he wasn't cutting the mustard, but I hadn't told him this yet. Paul's been working with him a lot. He killed the sunflower seeds in our dove field just recently, which is why Paul was here doing this. He told Paul a story the other day about how when he was in high school, he got in a fight with some black guys. And the FBI undercover team observed him fighting those guys and put him on an undercover team with 3 Navy SEALs. And that their job was to kill radical Black Panthers. And they did that from Myrtle Beach to Savannah. Now, I really don't think this guy, you know, is probably the person, but that's just so friggin'.
Yeah, that's kind of far-fetched story.
It's weird. But he was off today.
Okay.
He took his daddy to the doctor.
What's his name?
C.B. Rowe.
R-O-W-E?
Yeah, and I sent him a message to text me earlier today about the sunflowers, and he called me back when I was on the way to my mom's house.
Did you talk to him at that time?
Briefly, I was on the phone with a lawyer friend of mine named Chris Wilson from Bamberg, so I told him I'd call him back tomorrow, see him in the morning.
When you briefly talked to Mr. Rowe, what was his demeanor or attitude? Or?
I mean, it seemed normal. I mean, I asked him about the sunflowers, and so, you know, I mean, sure he's a little bit.
Where does he live?
I don't exactly know. Somewhere in Bronson.
Okay. Do you have his phone number?
I do.
You got it with you, please, sir?
I do. You know, but I do think him and Paul got along pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
That's just really, really weird.
Yes, Alex Murdaugh actually said all of that. So marinate on that and you'll hear my thoughts about it next week. Until then, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.